So it's imperative that I rinse this hose to ensure that I've removed any debris, contamination, dirt, dust, grit from this particular hose, because it'll ultimately jam up my nozzle. It does deem the whole thing unsafe if you've got a blocked nozzle, because then this will pressurise, and again you're asking the unloader valve to dump the excessive pressure. So if it starts dumping, that grit could remain within the premise of this housing and then ultimately go through the entire pump. And that's the same, it's indicative to the supply line as well. If you don't rinse that primary supply line of water and you pump grit, dirt and rubbish, contaminants through the pump won't last any time at all. So in that regard, if you use dirty hoses, use dirty water, you undermine the integrity of the pump, its longevity is diminished, you really only got yourself to blame. So as far as this steel insert's concerned, what I normally do is I'll rub some or place some Vaseline on it, but also too in this fitting as well, I'll apply a liberal amount of Vaseline. It doesn't matter if it blocks the hole, because remember you're using 4,000 psi, it will soon blow a bit of Vaseline out. It's not going to hurt the tip or the nozzle. So the Vaseline, there's an O-ring in the back of that stem. So the Vaseline keeps the O-ring supple and keeps corrosion at bay. So it's a lubricant in that regard. So I do that every time I take that hose out. But you've got to remember, every time you take that off, I've got to rinse it as well every time I go to use it again. So it's best to keep this as a closed, what we call a closed line. So this fitting remains on the pump unless you deem it necessary to remove it to stow it. But if I do that, I'll put a cap on the end of here. It doesn't matter if it's a bit of plastic or even a bit of duct tape. It really doesn't matter. But ultimately you'll cover that up. Because if you do get antibodies or contaminants within this particular line, it can block the line, and the line can actually balloon with the pressure or the blockage, which undermines the integral wall of the hose, but also too it could explode and get you. So as far as this is concerned, I can pop that on there, screw it up, and that little bit of Vaseline on that brass makes all the difference. Now, I've mentioned that this machine is 4,000 psi. So here's an imperative aspect. The machine is 4,000 psi, but is the hose rated to 4,000 psi? It's mandatory that you check that. Now, always on these hoses, they'll have a maximum pressure, so a WP and pressure, and it'll be in two ratings. It'll either be in bar or it'll be in PSI. So just remember that 1 bar is 14.5 psi. So if it says bar and you think, well, what's that in PSI? Well, I don't know, I've forgotten what he said. Was it 14.5, 14.6? I can't remember. All you have to do is take the cover off the gauge and the gauge will tell you PSI versus bar. So most of them are set up like this so that we can do that conversion quite quickly. So just remember, look for the identification plate on the equipment that you're using, establish what its maximum PSI is, primarily because that's indicative to the type of hoses that we connect to this machine. So as far as this machine is concerned, this hose rating here is 315 bar. 315 bar. Well, what does that work out to be? The 315 bar is about 4,000 psi.